you capture the 80 vibes and you give a different nuance comparing to the movie, because a lot of people that will play the game will actually probably will lend to the game after watching the movies. So how did you work on this aspect? Because you expect one sound from the soundtrack of the movie, of the two movie was really cool. In this sense, it's even more cooler because you actually see, you got a different side of the 80s. So how did you work on this aspect?
Yeah, it's a great question. We wanted well, Marvel right off the get-go wanted us to sort of take the franchise and make it our own and give it its own identity. So we had their blessing from the get-go, and I think it's something that it definitely helped us. I think if we would have tried to kind of do a sort of, well, this is the MCU in video games, it wouldn't have worked. It just it's a different medium, and it doesn't necessarily lend itself. So yeah, we decided, okay, how do we find our own voice in all of this? And through a lot of creative discussions, the team decided that setting our game in the 80s, whereas Peter and the MCU, it's a bit more 70s. They're more 70s based, so we said, well, let's go with the 80s, and I think it was just the timing as well. Like, there's a bit of a, well, maybe not now, but in the last, let's say, 5 years, there's been a bit of a resurgence of nostalgia for the 80s with, like, Stranger Things, which came out, which was huge. Ready Player One, which is a great movie that, captures a lot. So we wanted to play in that sandbox and make it our own. And I think we did. Once we got in there, we were like, all right, we're gonna make this as like a trip down 80s memory lane.
Yeah, and you were saying about what I love really in the video. You actually put the anime, but not just the anime from the 80s. Like the cartoon that we actually grew up.
Yeah.
People that were born in the 70s or in the 80s or in the 90s as well. So how did you manage to do that? I mean, it really felt like a time machine for me. I was like a kid again, watching,
That's so cool.
go back to school after school, put the
Yeah.
TV on and watch
Thing I
that.
love about Eidos Montreal is whenever we do something, like, we do it full out, like on 11. Um, so it's great. So when they had the idea to do this video, I mean, I thought it was a great idea. And originally, they talked about having the animated sequence, and that they were like, well, we're going to see if we can do the whole video animated. Obviously, it's a lot more costly and it's a lot more timely. And then I think it was either myself or my creative director that said, well, why don't we shoot a video and then kind of cut it? The tricky thing is we're trying to shoot the video, like you said, as if it was a relic from the 80s. And unfortunately, I don't look as young as I used to in the 80s. I looked a lot younger than this in the 80s, trust me. Um, so the video was shot in a way to kind of hide and mask the age and the road wear that I've taken on over the years from living the life that I have in music and in games. So it was shot that way intentionally. So there was a lot of thinking that went behind it, but ultimately we felt, if we could show something that felt authentic, that it came from the 80s, like, people would really enjoy it. And like you said, I thought it was a really great observation you make, is that whether you kind of came from 70s, 80s, or 90s, this style of animation, like, every decade has its version, whether it's Masters of the Universe or Gem and then the holograms or whatever. But there's like a version of this type of animation in every decade. So it's great that whether you grew up in the 90s or you grew up in the 80s, you can look at it and go, oh, it reminds me of insert here,
Yeah.
whatever it is.
I was thinking about Gem and the hologram because it actually was like it was like you're reading my mind in this.
There you go. There you go. No, but that's, again, it's a credit to the guys who came up with the animation, because it really does look, like you said, an authentic, something we would watch after school when we were growing up. For sure.
and and it's also good for the younger generation that will approach to the game, because in a certain way they are all fascinating, as you were saying, for Ready Player One or Stranger Things. They are fascinating for a time that they have never lived, actually,
Yeah.
because they were born like in the new millennium. So you were thinking about this aspect as well, working on the soundtrack, like
Yeah.
to bring the Generation Z to the data
Absolutely.
to that.
Yeah, no, because like we know our target market is maybe a lot of people like you said that haven't experienced that, but I do feel again with the popularity of like Stranger Things and Ready Player One that it is a generation that is probably more interested in the past than let's say when I grew up. Like when I grew up, if you were telling me like, oh well, back in the 50s, I was like, who cares.
Yeah.
Whereas now, I think the generation gap is a bit different. So I think when they look back to the 80s, it doesn't feel like back in like there was no electricity, and you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
it's not like it's that long ago. It's still like a good 40 years ago, but when I was in the 80s and someone said, well, remember in the 40s, I'd be like, the 40s? Like, I don't care about the 40s. But now from where we are now to the 80s, the jump doesn't seem as great. And the generation today seems very interested in some of the nostalgia, because I think people realize that while we've advanced with technology and everything, we've kind of lost something along the way. And there's a
Mhm.
bit of that nostalgia that I think people like us who grew up in 80s or 90s or whatever, we got to sort of experience that, but we're one of the last generations. Like